Okay, here we go with the DeepSkyStacker. This program is Windows only, but it is free. And what it does is it registers your light frames. It calibrates them with darks, flats, and bias files. And it stacks all of that together and can do things like sigma clipping to get rid of things that are abnormal, like hot pixels and just airplane streaks and all that kind of stuff. And it's a very easy to use program once you get the hang of it. It does this one thing very well, which is stacking, and doesn't do much else. So let's look at it. We're just going to use the basic features of it here. We start over here in the upper left-hand corner by clicking Open Picture Files. I'm going to click on that and find the light frames for the object that I'm working with. So if you've already organized like I have here, it's pretty easy. You just go into the M42 folder, click on the lights folder, and there's all of the files. If on your computer you are not seeing your files for some reason, just make sure that down here it's not set to something weird like JPEG only or picture files. It's set to just all files, and then you should see all of your raw files. I'm just going to click on one and then press Control A to select them all, and then click Open. Okay, what I can do here in DeepSkyStacker is click on one. I'm just going to click on the first one, and it gives me a nice little preview here of the file. We're not seeing much other than the really bright stars here. If we zoom in, we can see that there are dimmer stars as well. But if I wanted to brighten this picture up a bit, this is just for preview purposes. I can go up here to the upper right and drag this middle slider in a bit to the left. And it brightens up the picture some, and I can see some of the dimmer stars now, which is helpful for evaluating focus and also how much elongation of the stars there are in every frame. DeepSkyStacker can do some stuff with evaluating the stars for you, but if you want this more manual control, it's here for you. You can zoom in, you can look at the pictures, you can go through them one by one. It takes a second for it to load each picture. You can zoom in on this one, and I can decide, is this a frame that I want to keep or do I want to get rid of it? And I'm not going to show that whole process, but I'll just show you an example of a frame that you would not want to include. Let me go all the way down to the bottom here. And I remember at the end of the night, my last frame, I must have hit the tripod because there's like a little jitter in it. So let me zoom in on this. Okay, and you see that? That's on all of the stars, that little jitter on all of the stars. That's from knocking something or stepping too hard or whatever. And it can also happen from wind. But basically, we wouldn't want to include that frame. So how do we not include this frame? What we want to do is we first want to check all. So I'm going to go over here and click Check All. And then I'm going to just uncheck that last one, that one I don't want to include, just by clicking its little checkbox here to uncheck it. Okay, so we have 71 of 72 light frames checked. Now we're going to go ahead and add our dark frames. Click on Dark Files over here. I'm going to hit Control A to select all my darks, add those. If we look at one of those, I'm just going to click on one here. It doesn't look like much. If we really stretch it, still doesn't look like much. But that's what darks are. They're basically just correcting for hot pixels and thermal noise, things like that. let's go ahead and add our flat files. Control A to select all of these, click open. Brings in our flats. Let me stretch this a little bit so we can see what it looks like. Too much. There we go. So you can see that it gets a little bit darker towards the corners here. That's representing the vignetting. I don't know how clearly you can see that, but that's our flat frames. And last, our bias frames. Let's add these. Control A to select them. And we have 100 bias frames in here. Let's see if we can see anything in the bias. Sort of hard to see anything. But basically that represents the fixed pattern noise on the sensor, and it can get rid of horizontal and vertical banding problems that is common with DSLRs. Okay, so we have all of this added now. And remember, with that last light frame, I unchecked it. Looks good. If we want, we can look at the raw settings, which are down here under Options, Raw Settings. And these are the same as the last time I set them up. I just use this default bare matrix interpolation. I've always used camera white balance because I'm always careful to set that. If you didn't, just uncheck that to not use it at all. I always set the black point to 0, which helps with calibration, I believe. And if you change any of these, just remember to click Apply before you click OK. Next thing we're going to do is over here on the left-hand side under Registering and Stacking. Click on Register Checked Pictures. And it brings up your register settings. These will be whatever you last set them at. So if you want it to automatically detect and remove hot pixels, make sure just to check that. I'm going to do that. If you've already registered the pictures, you can use this option right above there, but I haven't registered these together yet, meaning putting them all in the same place so the stars match up. So I'm going to leave that unchecked. I want to check stack after registering because I do want that to happen. And right here it says select the best percentage pictures and stack them. You can change this to whatever you want. Basically, it just assigns a score to each picture based on how round the stars are. And if you only wanted to include like the best 50% or 80%, you can set that right here. If you want to include everything, just put in 100%. I'm going to put in 97% because maybe there's one that I didn't catch that it could throw out. Next thing I do is I go over here to the Advanced tab, and by default it sets this star detection threshold to 10%. You may need to change this though to get a good number of stars. If you're below, let's say 50 stars, you'd probably want to change the detection. If you're above 1,000 stars, you might also want to change that detection because then it might be picking up hot pixels and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and click on compute the number of detected stars. It looks at the first light frame and sees how many stars it can find. Looks like I have plenty here. It found almost 300, so that's fine. I could just leave this alone at 10%, but if I wanted to speed this up a little bit, I might take this down to 20%. I'll compute again. And now it's down to 177 stars. So it's just fewer stars to match against. Usually works a little bit faster and better. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to go ahead and click on this reduce the noise by using a median filter. And then I'm going to click on recommended settings. And basically you can just step through this, and anytime where it's highlighted in blue here, you can read what it says. If you are using a modded DSLR, well, I'm not, so I'm going to ignore that. If you are processing narrowband images, I'm not, so I'm going to ignore that one. And then you just go through each one, and if it's something that you haven't done, you can just click on that and it will put that into your recommended settings. I'm using Sigma clipping, I'm using bilinear debarring, and blah, blah, blah. So you can go through there, make sure you have all the recommended settings, click OK. If you want to go into stacking parameters and look at these, this has much more detail. I'm not going to go into all of this right now because this isn't a video about DeepSkyStacker. It's sort of an overview of all the processing, so this would take too long. But there are other videos online, so if you're interested, you can learn about all these different settings in here. This is good enough, though. We're going to go ahead and click OK. And it gives us a nice summary here of everything. We're going to be stacking 72 light frames with offset or bias, dark and flats. Specifically 100 bias, 25 darks, and 29 flats. The total exposure is 38 minutes, 24 seconds. All looks good. I'm going to go ahead and click OK to start the process. And off it goes. It starts by stacking together all of your bias or offset frames into a master bias. It then does the same thing for darks and flats. It then calibrates all your individual light frames with those master calibration frames, and then registers and stacks your light frames into your final single integrated image, which you can then preview here in DeepSkyStacker, but usually you just save it off and we move on to Photoshop or GIMP. I'm going to speed up this part of the video because it's going to take at least 10 minutes, probably more like 15 or 20, and then I'll show you saving out of DeepSkyStacker when this is all done. Okay, so what it's doing right now is it's saving the autosave.tiff file to my lights folder. This is important. This is a 32-bit tiff file that you can consider your master stack. Photoshop can actually read a 32-bit tiff file, so you could bring it right into the autosave.tiff right into Photoshop. Not all features in Photoshop are 32-bit, so you might have to eventually convert it to a 16-bit file. If you're going to be working with GIMP, it probably can't even open that 32-bit file. So we're going to have to first save the picture to file, which is over here on the left-hand side under processing, and save it as an uncompressed 16-bit TIFF. One thing that's a little bit confusing here about DeepSkyStacker is it's making the final picture right here on screen, and there's a bunch of settings we could change right here in DeepSkyStacker, but it's not really meant as a processing program. It's just a stacking program. So really there's not much point in doing much here because we're not going to save these changes anyways. So I'm just going to leave all of that alone and go over here to where it says save picture to file. And I'll just save it here to my desktop, to my M42 folder. And I'll call it stack.tiff. And I'm going to say compression none. And I want to just leave this option that says embed adjustments in the saved image but do not apply them checked. So basically just exactly how it was, and click save. Okay, now that we've stacked in DeepSkyStacker, we are going to look at GIMP, which is a free open source program, sort of like a Photoshop clone, but it's been around for a very long time. And I am using the latest stable release at the time of this recording, which is 2.10.8. For a long time, GIMP did not support 16-bit image files and processing, but it now does with 2.10. And so we're going to use that 16-bit stack tiff that we generated out of DeepSkyStacker and do just some stretching and color and things like that in GIMP. And I will admit that I do not know, I'm not an expert in this program, but a lot of things are at least somewhat similar to how you would do them in Photoshop. So I know Photoshop very well, so it sort of translates over to GIMP. But I don't know everything about it. And so I might do some things wrong or just a roundabout way. And if you have any suggestions, you can leave them in the comments. But hopefully this is helpful for people who do not own or want to own Photoshop or PixInsight are the ones that I normally use. So anyways, let's get started here. I'm going to open up GIMP 2.10. And I'm going to go up here to File, Open, and pick my stack.tiff there from DeepSkyStacker. Okay, and the first thing that I like to do in GIMP is just take this floating window here holding the image and stretch it out to fill this space in between the panels over here and the panel over here. And then I like to go up here to the View menu and turn off rulers. Rulers are helpful if you're working on like a print design, but I'm just processing astrophotography here, so I don't need the rulers on. And I also like to turn off this what do they call this? Show layer boundary. It's under View, Show Layer Boundary, and it just turns off that yellow dotted line because I just find that distracting. Okay, after we have it open, keyboard shortcuts you should know is minus zooms you out, plus zooms you in. And you can see here in this stacked image, we're not seeing much detail of the Orion Nebula other than in the core here. And it's going to be hard to retain all of that detail in the core once we stretch the image, but we'll try to do a few tricks to bring it back in after we've stretched. So I'm going to zoom back out a bit here. Okay, and the first thing I'm going to do is over here in the Layers panel, the panel is actually called Layers-Brushes. I'm going to make sure that I have stack.tiff selected here, and then I'm going to right-click on it and say Duplicate Layer. And I'll rename that duplicate First Stretch. Okay, and now with that first stretch layer selected, I'm going to go to Colors, the Colors menu at the top, Colors, and then Levels. So Colors, then Levels. And this shows me the histogram here. This is just a luminance histogram, and it's showing me that there's this very sharp mountain right there. It's not to even a quarter over yet. It's sort of at maybe an eighth of the way over. And there's some room over here on this side showing this is just clipped to black, but there's lots of room for it to grow this way. So I'm going to take this middle slider and move that, if I can grab it here, come on. There we go. Move that to the left, about halfway over, and you'll see it does sort of an initial stretch here, and I'll go ahead and click OK on that. Okay, so we have our first stretch in there, but we're going to continue with this stretching a little bit, resetting that midway point over to the left and then resetting the black point a couple times. So we just keep going back here to Colors, Levels, and we take this middle slider and again move it over a little bit. What just happened? Cancel. We take this middle slider and move it over to brighten the image, and then we take this left-hand slider and move that over to reset the black point. And you might be thinking, oh, is this even doing anything or what? You can always zoom in on the nebula here, just with plus, center it on screen. And if I turn off and on this first stretch, you can see we're raising up the sky background a little bit at this point, but we're also bringing out more detail in this stretching process. You can see M43 is starting to appear here in the first stretch, right here. And in the stacked image, we barely see it. But we have to do this a few times to bring out enough detail. So I'm going to go again, colors, levels, and again, take this middle slider, move it over, take the left-hand slider, move that to the right, and again, the middle, whoops. We have to do this a few times to really see what's going on here. So this time I'm just going to focus on bringing that up. Okay. And then I'm going to go back in there. Colors, levels, and I'm going to bring this one over quite a bit. And we're getting close here. You can see the Running Man Nebula is coming into focus. Maybe just one more. Colors, levels. Okay, and so you can see there's a lot of detail in here. But one thing you'll notice here is that our whole sky background is very red. That's because of light pollution and the Earth's atmosphere, bouncing that light pollution back down, and it gives us this very red color. The other thing you'll notice here is that there is a gradient. If we zoom out, we can see that there is this gradient where it's darker at the top and brighter at the bottom. That's because light pollution is coming from the Earth, and so it's usually going to make this gradient where the light dome setting the bottom of your frame, and then it gets darker as it goes up. There's also a little bit of a gradient left to right here because probably there was more light pollution over here on the right side than there was on the left side. So what we want to do is we want to model this background and subtract it. The way I like to do that here in GIMP is a little bit different than how I do it in Photoshop. I'm going to use my color picker tool, which is right here in the second row of tools, 4 over. And I'm going to first set my foreground color with a value down here at the bottom. Sets it there. And then I'm going to change this to set background color. And I'm going to pick one up here in the upper left corner. And basically that just gives me a background value and a foreground value of the sky here. Then I'm going to make a new layer. So if I go over here to the layers panel and just click on the create a new layer button, just make it a normal layer. And on that layer, I'm going to pick my gradient tool here, which is 6 rows down in the tools selection. And the gradient tool should automatically be set to custom gradient using the foreground and background color. If it's not for some reason, just click on the little gradient swatch there and you can make sure to set it custom foreground to background. If you have to do further editing of the gradient thing, just click into here and you can mess around with that, but this looks good. And now I'm basically just going to try to recreate the background with my gradient tool here. And so I'm going to click down here and stretch up to here. Let's see how that looks. Let go. That looks pretty good. I'm just going to turn the visibility of this off and on. See how that looks. And I think that this sample should actually go quite a bit higher to make the bottom half of this brighter. Let me look at that again. And I'm actually going to move this sample over to the right a little bit here. Maybe a bit too far. Split the difference. Okay, that looks pretty good. We'll see how it works now. I'm going to accept that gradient. And I'm going to go over here to this layer with the gradient on it and change the mode to normal here in the, or from normal to subtract, sorry. So find subtract here. And what that should do is it should take this background and subtract it from the layer right below, first stretch. That looks good. And so I'm going to go ahead and then just merge that layer down into the first stretch. So you just go to layer, merge down. Okay, so we've removed the background. Might still have some artifacts there when we stretch it more, but it's a good first step. And then let's go ahead and duplicate that first stretch layer. Generally, this is the way I work in GIMP, is just to take a few actions on a layer. Once you finish those actions, just duplicate it and move on to the next thing you're doing. So I'm going to call this one curves. And on this new curves layer, we're going to go to colors, curves, and take this floating window that says curves and try just putting in a curve like that. Okay. And it looks like our background removal was a little bit too aggressive because it killed some of this outer nebulosity. So I'm going to step back a few steps here. Turn this off for a second. And I'm going to go back here to this first stretch, and I'm going to stretch it just a little bit more. So I'm going to go to colors, levels, colors, levels, and I'm going to bring this over just a bit more. Colors, levels, and just bring this over a bit more. Trying to make that faint nebulosity out there show up a bit more. And then I'm going to look at this again. Yeah, that's much better. Even though we're showing a bit more of this gradient here, we can now see a lot more of that nebulosity there. Let me just try, I'm going to go ahead and merge that down. Layer, merge down. And then I'm just going to subtract the background one more time. So I'm going to pick 2 new samples here. Oops, set foreground color, set background color. Make a new layer. Make a gradient. All right, let's try subtracting that. All right, we have a little bit of funkiness still here, maybe like a little bit more blue down here, a little bit more green over there, but overall that's getting pretty good. We can desaturate the sky a little bit in a second here anyways. So I'm just going to go ahead and merge that down. And I'll duplicate this first stretch layer. And now we're on our way with doing some curves. Sorry for the interruption there, but again, I'm sort of new to GIMP, so sometimes it takes me a couple of tries. So we'll go back here to colors, curves. Let's stretch this out a bit. Again, I realize we have some funkiness in the sky down there, but we'll desaturate that in a second. I'm really just focusing here on the nebula, so let me zoom in on that a bit. Oh, can't while this is open, so I'm just going to accept that. Zoom in on the nebula, and that looks really nice. Pretty similar to what we were seeing in Photoshop, if you watched that one. Some nice detail in there. We have the outer nebula, we have the running man. So I'm going to go ahead and accept that that's good. And I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this layer. And call it background reset. All right, and I'm going to zoom back out. I'm going to select by color. I'll try to select sort of both of these colors here just by clicking and dragging over that gradient from this blue to green. Give it a second here. Okay, it selects the background pretty well there. You can see it's not selecting the stars or the bright part of the nebula. And we just want to go and do colors, saturation. This little thing that says scale means when it's at 1, that's just no change. If we made it higher than 1, it would increase the saturation. We want to decrease the saturation, so I'm going to click in there, highlight, set it to 0.4. Enter. Wait for it to show me a preview here. Not sure if that worked. I'm going to click OK and see what it does. Let me see how much that desaturated. Oh yeah, it was working. Let me just do it again. So the selection is still on there. It just takes it a second here to generate that. And we'll go back into colors, saturation, and I'm going to set it to let's try 0.2 this time. Enter. Get a preview. Nice. So it's desaturated again. And with that selection still active, let's this time go into curves. And just try setting the black point a little bit to the right here. So I'm just going to drag that point over. And maybe I'll make one more point here and drag it down a little bit. And I'm specifically going to try to get rid of this greenish value here by dragging that down. All right, let's try this again. So I'm going to duplicate this layer, curves, and we're going to work on fixing the background. So I'll call this BG reset. And first, let's just try doing something with curves here. And I'm going to first work on the green there. I'm going to bring that point over a little bit. You can see that's working pretty well on that left-hand side there. Okay, and then I'm going to go into the blues and do the same thing. That worked pretty well. Maybe just bring them down just a tad bit more in the brighter parts here. Okay, actually that worked pretty well. didn't hit the nebula too bad, and we fixed a lot of the sky problems there. So let me go ahead and make a duplicate of the curves layer here now. Again, I'm going to put that on top of my background reset, and I'm going to apply a screen blending mode. Did a pretty good job of getting rid of that green and blue, but then I replaced it with some redness here. So I'm going to go ahead and now just select by color and grab this red background. And go to colors, saturation, bring the saturation of that down quite a bit, so it starts at 1. I'm going to go ahead and put in 0.2. Looks good. Accept that. We can get rid of the selection now by going to select. None. I'm going to duplicate this background reset layer. Call it more curves. And we'll go back here to layer, no, colors, curves. And let's bring this curve up again. Okay, and at this point I'm trying to just sort of apply a bit of an S curve to this. So basically keeping the dark sky low, but bringing out the nebula detail a bit more. But you don't want to bring it up too high that you're making the stars really bloated and big, so it's sort of a balance here. But that's pretty good. Go ahead and click OK. At this point, rather than keep fighting with this lower part that's keeps coming up when I stretch, I'm just going to crop that away. because it's not really important to the composition anyways. So I'm just going to crop to this central part here. And let's go ahead and go back here to our first stretch and duplicate that. And I'm going to call this core. I'm going to bring the core back up here to the top. And it has a lot more core detail in there. And I'm going to go ahead and apply what's called a layer mask, which is right down here. It has a little mask icon, and fill that with black. So right now we're not seeing any of that core detail, but we're just going to go back to our default colors here by pressing D, and then I'm going to switch white to the top of my foreground color, and I just want to paint in a little bit of that core detail with a nice low opacity soft brush. So I have mine set here to 30% opacity. It's nice and big and soft. And then I'll just paint in a little bit of that core. Bring down the size. Okay, and then if I went a little bit overboard, I can always hit X to switch to black and just sort of paint it back a little bit. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. I'm just going to do another layer here, but I want sort of everything that I've created just like this. So I'm going to do layer new from visible. It makes a new visible layer right there, and I'm going to go ahead and call this final touches. And I'll start my final touches with, again, layer curve or colors curves. And let's just bring up the faint stuff just a tad. Yeah, looks cool. And let's also now fix our saturation level. Got a little bit washed out. I'm gonna raise this up to, let's say, 1.5. Yeah, cool. And now the background just got a tad raised up a little bit too high, so let me just go back into curves one more time, reset that black point, back down. Okay. Zoom in here a bit. All right, so not too bad. We get a little bit of the brownish dust around the objects. Running Man came out nice. Orion Nebula came out pretty nice. Got a little bit of that outer nebulosity, lots of good detail in here. Stars are a little bit bloated, and if I did a little bit more work over here, I could probably fix that a bit. But this gives you an initial idea of how to work with GIMP after making a stack of your data in DeepSkyStacker. So hopefully this made some sense. To review the main points, it's just about duplicating a layer, doing an action like stretching with levels, duplicating it again, trying curves, trying to neutralize that background as best you can. We did that through making a gradient and subtracting it, but I'm sure there might be other good ways to do that in GIMP. And then we just did a little bit of HDRing by bringing in this the core just tapping it down with a first stretch, and then some final touches, bringing back in the saturation and bringing up that outer nebulosity a little bit. So that's it. You can then save it off as all kinds of different things, TIFF or JPEG or whatever you want. Let me know if there's anything that I missed about astrophotography processing in GIMP, or if you want to see something different. I'd be happy to try to learn more about it. But again, it's not my main processing tool. I mostly use PixInsight and Photoshop. Thanks for watching.